We prepared a writ of habeas corpus, which we plan to submit this morning at 8 o'clock. However, when we called at 8 for the purpose of ascertaining the whereabouts of the sheriff for making service, we were informed that Reverend King had been taken down to Reidsville at 4:05 this morning.
After representing King before the Georgia Court of Appeals, Hollowell chartered a plane to Reidsville to pick up his client, 8 days after police jailed him in Atlanta.
Dr. King would not have been released unless there was some legal action taken to release him. And the legal action that was taken to release him was a habeas corpus petition that Horace Ward and Don Hollowell prepared and fought. It was Horace Ward and Don Hollowell who were driving up and down the roadway of Georgia, going back and forth from Atlanta to Reidsville.
In protest of the Jim Crow practices among Atlanta's white businesses, Atlanta student movement leaders staged mass sit-ins at local department stores. On October 19, 1960, veteran civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King joined the demonstration, and he was among the over 50 demonstrators arrested, including SNCC leaders and 5 student body presidents from the Atlanta University complex. One of them was Julian Bond.
I had been chosen out of the group arrested at Atlanta City Hall to be tried for my group. I'm standing between these two men whom I meet for the first time in my life, Donald Hollowell on my right, A.T. Walden on my left, and I really don't understand what's happening. It's the first time I've ever been in court. And there's some back and forth between these two men and the judge. And the judge says to me, "How do you plead?" Well, I was stunned. How do I plead? I didn't know what to do. I turned to look at Colonel Walden, who was the older of these two men, and he was engaged in a conversation with the bailiff. So I couldn't get an answer there. I turned to Don Hollowell, and he said in this stage whisper, I'm sure could be heard throughout the whole classroom, he said, "Not guilty, you fool." And I said, "Not guilty."
I was the first young law school graduate that Hollowell brought to his office. Horace Ward came in September, and we had a very good time. I carried Hollowell's briefcase, I drove his car, I did his research. I studied under him. I was his law clerk, I was his intern, I was his mentee. And we had lots of little cases, too numerous to mention, having to do with violations of civil rights. The most significant by far was the University of Georgia case.
I would just like to think that the people at the university and around the university are sufficiently fair-minded to want to see any Georgia citizen get the best education possible at the facilities which are provided by the state.
Once we got into university, for example, we were suspended the second day we were on the campus because of the riot outside of my dormitory. And we came to Atlanta in the middle of the night, and the next day the lawyers, Hollowell and Motley, went to court to get us readmitted. The Albany movement mobilized mass demonstrations, bus boycotts, sit-ins, and jail-ins. On December 16, 1961, after more than 500 demonstrators had been arrested, SCLC leaders Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy joined the Albany movement with a prayer vigil at City Hall.
Let's move out or you're under arrest. Either one now. Doesn't make a difference.
Responding to the arrest, Hollowell teamed up with his longtime friend C.B. King, Albany's noted civil rights attorney.
Hollowell and C.B. King raised the legal questions and forced the government, both at the local and national level, local, state, and national levels, to face the issues of segregation and discrimination and brutality on the part of law enforcement officials. So they did it brilliantly, and Albany was never the same.
These are unsung, not much appreciated heroes. And most people who benefited from their commitment and from their talents don't know their name, but know what they do. But they are the beneficiaries of these lawyers, black lawyers who went home from law school to make their talents as lawyers available to the ultimate aspirations of black people: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on the basis of equal opportunity. That's the American way.
Good evening. Very touching excerpt to a video, so I want everyone flocking out to buy a copy. Welcome. I'm O.B. Clayton, and I'm here to kick this first inaugural lecture off. But before I start, I'd like to thank, for being in attendance and participating, our Senior Vice President for External Affairs, Mr. Tom Landrum, for being here, to our Dean Daniels, who put together the little excerpt that you saw, Mrs. Louise Hollowell, that's on the front row here, that spoke earlier. At 103 years old, after having taught for 40 years, she can still talk. I'd also like to thanks for coming any of the Board of Visitors that may be in the audience tonight, all of the distinguished guests, and I'm not going to try to name them all, and I'll put a deer on this for all of my colleagues who came out in force. My office is on the second floor of Tucker Hall, and we have 100% attendance. So the other floors will have to work a little harder. Some of my golfing buddies that I've never seen in anything but golfing attire, they know who they are. Thanks for coming. Colleagues from across the campus, they call it the main campus, from the sociology department, thanks for being here. All of the friends and volunteers who worked to put this lecture together, thanks for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that covers everybody, right? Except our special guests, who happen to be my students. They're attending the lecture. They'll have to write a paper about it, but they're here, and I thank them. So welcome again to the inaugural lecture, the first in the Hollowell Lecture Series. This series was organized by the UGA School of Social Work and the Don Hollowell Lecture Committee. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Ms. Jennifer Abbott, Ms. Janelle Muckle, Ms. Kat Farlow, Ms. Norma Armas, and Mr. Leon Banks. These people have worked overtime to make this evening possible. As you know, the topic of tonight's lecture is affirmative opportunity in the Barack Obama era. Affirmative opportunity in the Barack Obama era. And as you know, and many of you met, our speaker is Professor William Julius Wilson of Harvard University, who will be introduced later on the program by an MSW student, class of 12, Emily Whipper. Now, as that talk mentions, affirmative opportunity, we look forward to this evening's lecture because we know that everything that Attorney Hollowell worked for and fought for throughout his career was equal opportunity. Equal opportunity is now present not only at the University of Georgia, University of Mississippi, where I spent 6 days, but all over the country. However, as we all know, from reading the paper and just living in civil society, it is something that must be safeguarded. And we'll hear bits and pieces of that today. A core part of our mission, and that is the mission of UGA, is to facilitate communication, collaboration, exchanges, and partnerships between the university and the larger community. We do this to ensure that diversity is respected. We know that in acting as enablers and catalysts in this way, we're helping to create a value for diversity in this ever-shrinking world. To give greetings from the university, I will ask Senior Vice President Tom Landrum to come forward.
Thank you very much, Professor, and boy, what a great turnout for this inaugural lecture. It's my role on behalf of the University of Georgia to welcome each one of you to the campus tonight for this beautiful evening and for this special occasion, the inaugural Don Hollowell Lecture. This lecture, as well as the Hollowell Distinguished Professor of Social Justice and Civil Rights Studies, are named in honor, of course, of Mr. Hollowell, who was the leading civil rights attorney in Georgia during the 1950s and 60s. And the University of Georgia is proud to honor one of our nation's greatest advocates for social justice in this way by hosting this lecture and by having an endowed professorship in his name. Many of you know that at the 2002 commencement exercises here at the university, Dr. Michael Adams, the president, bestowed upon Mr. Hollowell the Honorary Doctor of Laws degree for exemplary and broad contributions to society. I still remember how the provost at the time, Dr. Arnett Mace, who is considerably shorter than Donald Hollowell, had to literally stand on his tiptoes to put that cape over Mr. Hollowell, and Mr. Hollowell graciously stooped down so that he could make that conferring. When that degree was conferred, that was only the 75th honorary doctorate conferred in the 200-plus year history of the University of Georgia. So it was a remarkable accomplishment. And in terms of the distinguished professorship, it started with a significant lead gift from the University of Georgia Athletic Association. And then many friends and colleagues stepped up after that lead gift to expand the endowment to the level of a distinguished professorship. Vernon Jordan was the chair of the Donald Hollowell Endowment Committee. He spent countless hours on the telephone twisting the arms of numerous people to make gifts. Some of you may be in the room tonight and your arm maybe has never recovered. Dr. Adams provided support for the documentary for the grand premiere event, which was a wonderful event. That was the premiere of the Foot Soldier for Equal Justice documentary, a portion of which we saw just a few minutes ago. And the special gifts that came from that evening helped augment the endowment. Professor Jerry Moorhead, who is the provost of the university today, worked very closely with the dean and approved a faculty line in the university's budget for the professorship. And then Dean Daniels hired the gentleman who was here just a minute ago, Dr. Obie Clayton, as the inaugural Donald L. Hollowell Professor. And we are exceptionally proud at the university to have someone of his caliber on our faculty. The university continues to support the multidisciplinary Foot Soldier Project and its research, community outreach, TV documentaries, and publications that are produced in the arena of civil rights studies, which strives to preserve the legacy of the late Mr. Hollowell. Again, I welcome you on this special occasion as we anticipate remarks by our distinguished speaker, Professor Wilson, and as we commemorate the life of a truly remarkable man and a true civil rights pioneer, Mr. Don Hollowell. Thank you, and we look forward to the show.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good evening. On behalf of the faculty and staff and students of the School of Social Work, the Foot Soldier Project for Civil Rights Studies, it is a distinct pleasure for me to stand here and welcome you to our inaugural Donald L. Hollowell Lecture. On a personal level, I am ever reminded that I stand here standing on the shoulders of Mr. Hollowell, because he was the man who led the effort to desegregate the University of Georgia, that made it possible for myself and other persons of my persuasion to be able to attend this university and serve as faculty members at this university, and even serve as a dean at this university. So thanks to Mr. Hollowell and all of his comrades for fighting the good fight to make democracy more of a reality at this university as well as in our state. It seems just a short while ago that we dreamed of the possibility of endowing the Donald L. Hollowell Distinguished Professorship. We didn't have any money, didn't have a lot of resources. Some said it's a small school, it'll take you 10 years to create the professorship. But because of your support and your contributions, that dream is now a reality. The Hollowell Professorship and the Hollowell Lecture are the result of a great deal of hard work from many good citizens of our university community. In recognition of your hard work and dedication, I offer my sincere thanks. First, my appreciation to Dr. William Julius Wilson for so graciously agreeing to be our speaker for this evening. Dr. Wilson is truly a giant in civil rights and social justice studies, and we are honored to have him here at our beloved university. I'd also like to thank, as Tom Landrum noted, President Michael Adams, Provost Jerry Moorhead, and certainly Tom and other university administrators, as well as the Hollowell Endowment Committee, chaired by Mr. Vernon Jordan, for their unswerving support of the Foot Soldier Project and the Hollowell Professorship. I'd like to also specially recognize Dr. Obie Clayton, our inaugural Donald L. Hollowell Distinguished Professor. Dr. Clayton was instrumental in developing this lecture series, and he is truly an asset to our students, our faculty, and certainly to our university. I'm also deeply indebted to the faculty of the Foot Soldier Project for their great work, along with the Russell Library, as well as the Center for Teaching and Learning, that produced the documentary which ultimately led to the endowment of the Hollowell Professorship. As we prepare to listen to what will surely be a very stimulating talk by Dr. Wilson, I am compelled to recognize a few very special guests who have been integral in the success of the Foot Soldier Project, the Hollowell Professorship, and now the Hollowell Lecture. First, for their major support of the endowment of the Hollowell Professorship, if they are present, Federal Judge Clarence Cooper and Mrs. Shirley Cooper, are they present? Okay, we also have Attorney William Jenkins and Attorney Brendan Roberts. Would you stand? Secondly, I'd like to recognize members of the School of Social Work Board of Visitors who are present and who are in attendance, Dr. Alton Gregory and Mrs. Peggy Gregory. Doctors Catherine and John Davies. And this professorship and certainly lecture series would not be possible without the support of our faculty, staff, and students of the School of Social Work. And I'd like for you to stand, please. Faculty, staff, and students. Thank you very much. In addition to his major role in desegregating the University of Georgia, Mr. Hollowell also played a pivotal role in chronicling the history of the desegregation of the University of Georgia. In an interview with him many years ago, he brought to the Foot Soldier Project's attention that Mary Frances Early had been overlooked in the chronicling of the history of the desegregation of the University of Georgia. Today, a professorship in the College of Education is named for Miss Early, and a signature lecture, the Mary Frances Early Lecture, is held annually at our institution. I'm pleased that Miss Mary Frances Early is in attendance tonight. Miss Early, would you please stand? For their generous support of the Foot Soldier Project for Civil Rights Studies, I would also like to recognize at this time former Georgia Supreme Court Justice Hardy Gregory and Attorney Tony Gregory. Thank you. Finally, it gives me great joy to acknowledge a lady of great patience, of great dignity, of great dedication and commitment to the cause of civil rights. At this time, I'd like to pay special recognition to the 103 years young Louise Thornton Hollowell. At this time, we have a member of the class of 2012 for our MSW program. Her name is Miss Emily Whipper. She is a student in the class of Dr. Obie Clayton. She's a native of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She's a graduate of St. Lawrence University in New York, and we're delighted to have her to come at this time to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ms. Whipper.
Good evening. I'm very honored to introduce our world-renowned speaker this evening, Dr. William Julius Wilson of Harvard University. Professor William Julius Wilson is the Louis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor at Harvard University. He is one of only 22 university professors, the highest professional distinction for a Harvard faculty member. Dr. Wilson received his PhD from Washington State University in 1966, then taught sociology at UMass Amherst before joining the University of Chicago faculty in 1972. He joined the faculty at Harvard in 1996. He is the past president of the American Sociological Association and has received 44 honorary degrees, including honorary doctorates from Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, Northwestern, Johns Hopkins, Dartmouth, and the University of Amsterdam. He was a MacArthur Prize Fellow from 1987 to 1992 and has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Education, the American Philosophical Society, the Institute of Medicine, and the British Academy. In 1996, he was selected by Time magazine as one of America's 25 most influential people. He is a recipient of the 1998 National Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor bestowed in the United States. He is the author of numerous publications, including The Declining Significance of Race, as well as The Truly Disadvantaged, a very, very important work, which was selected by the editors of the New York Times Book Review as one of the 16 best books of 1987. He has written When Work Disappears, The World of the New Urban Poor, which was selected again as one of the notable books of 1996 by the editors of the New York Times Book Review, and received the Sidney Hillman Foundation Award. He also wrote The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, Rising Inequality and Coalition Politics. More recently, he is the co-author of There Goes the Neighborhood, Racial, Ethnic, and Class Tensions in 4 Chicago Neighborhoods and Their Meaning for America. He's also written Good Kids in Bad Neighborhoods, Successful Development in Social Context. His latest book is More Than Just Race, Being Black and Poor in the Inner City. Other honors granted to Dr. Wilson include the Seidman Award in Political Economy. He's the first and only non-economist to receive this award. The Golden Plate Achievement Award, the Distinguished Alumnus Award, Washington State University, the American Sociological Association's Du Bois Johnson Fraser Award, the American Sociological Association's Award for Public Understanding of Sociology, Burton Gordon Feldman Award for Outstanding Contributions in the Field of Public Policy, Brandeis University. He's received the Martin Luther King Jr. National Award granted by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Aaron Wildavsky Enduring Contribution Award for The Truly Disadvantaged and When Work Disappears from the American Political Science Association. He was designated a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow at Harvard University for 2009-2010. He was also a member of the President's Commission on White House Fellowships from 1994 to 2001. We are so honored to have him here at the University of Georgia as the inaugural Hollowell Lecture, culminating an exciting civil rights speaker series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'm very pleased and indeed honored to deliver the inaugural Donald L. Hollowell Lecture at this great university, and also pleased that Mrs. Hollowell is in the audience tonight to hear my remarks. As Emily Whipper noted, Obie Clayton as well, the title of my talk is Race and Affirming Opportunity in the Barack Obama Era. Last December, the Obama administration supplied colleges and universities with important guidelines on how to increase racial diversity on campuses. Prepared by the Department of Education, the document stated that diversity contributes to the educational and economic life of this nation. And it suggested ways to navigate the Supreme Court's narrow legal channel to address racial inequities. As stated in the New York Times editorial, quote, "The administration's support for such efforts stand in stark contrast to the policy of the George W. Bush administration to discourage them. That difference has played out between the political parties for decades, as it will in this presidential election," unquote. Since the 1970s, the Supreme Court has limited available approaches to remedy racial disparities, but has allowed institutions to consider race in achieving certain broader objectives. The United States Court of Appeals for the 6th District has agreed to reconsider Michigan's 2006 voter-approved ban on affirmative action in public university admissions, a ban that was struck down by a 3-judge panel on the court in 2011. This case and 2 other notable and recent lawsuits reveal that the controversy over affirmative action rages on. A year ago, a 3-judge panel in the 5th Circuit upheld the use of race as a plus factor in admissions at the University of Texas at Austin. 4/5 of the students at the University of Texas are admitted as graduates in the top 10% of their classes. The remaining 1/5 is admitted on the basis of individual assessments, which includes race. This latter part of the University of Texas admissions procedure, the 1/5 admitted based on individual assessment, including race, is now being challenged. And several weeks ago, the Supreme Court agreed to review this complaint. Also, a 3-judge panel of the 9th Circuit has agreed to hear an appeal from a district court's decision to dismiss a challenge to California's Proposition 209, which outlawed race-conscious college admissions in 1996. All of these cases could eventually end up before the Supreme Court, which now includes 4 very conservative justices who have made it clear that they would rule against even narrowly tailored racial diversity programs. To refresh your memory of the Supreme Court's position on the use of race in addressing issues of racial diversity, in 2003, it considered 2 cases involving affirmative action at the University of Michigan. And although the court ruled that the University of Michigan could not set quotas for certain racial groups or give them extra points in undergraduate admissions, the university could consider race as one factor in the law school's holistic admissions process. And with that backdrop, my talk today puts the discussion about racial diversity and affirmative action in a broader social context and suggests ways to reinforce the Obama's administration's guidance to promote racial diversity on campus. According to a 2008 Newsweek poll, nearly 3/4 of all Americans disapprove, quote, of giving preferences to blacks and other minorities in things like hiring, promotions, and college admissions, unquote. 3/4 of all Americans disapprove. Now, this is consistent with earlier polls, including a 2003 Time CNN poll in which a majority of Americans disapproved of, quote, affirmative action admissions programs at colleges and law schools that give racial preferences to minority applicants, unquote. To help us understand this opposition to racial preferences as a way to overcome inequality, two factors should be seriously considered, particularly when the focus is on African Americans. The first factor is clearly racial, a perception that blacks are responsible for their own economic predicament and therefore undeserving of special government support. Indeed, research by my colleague at Harvard, Larry Bobo, and others have shown that the idea that the federal government has a special obligation to help improve the living standards of blacks because they have been discriminated against for so long has never exceeded support by more than 1 in 4 whites since 1975. And significantly, the lack of white support for this idea is not related to background factors such as level of education and age. The second major factor in the opposition to perceived racial preferences is a heavy reliance on individualistic explanations of social behavior and social outcomes in this country. It is an unavoidable fact that Americans tend to de-emphasize the structural origins and social significance of poverty and welfare. In other words, the popular view is that people are poor or on welfare because of their own personal shortcomings. We can easily see that explanations focusing on the character and capabilities of the individual dominate American thinking. Consider studies of national public opinion. On the basis of an analysis of national survey data collected since 1969, the sociologists James Klugel and Elliott Smith concluded, quote, most Americans believe that opportunity for economic advancement is widely available, that economic outcomes are determined by individuals' efforts and talents or their lack, and that in general, economic inequality is fair. Now bear in mind, this study was published before Occupy the movement raised their awareness about inequality. But nonetheless, the point is well taken. Indeed, responses to questions in these national American surveys revealed that individualistic explanations for poverty, for example, lack of effort or ability, poor moral character, slack work skills, were overwhelmingly favored over structural explanations, for example, lack of adequate schooling, low wages, lack of jobs, and so on. The weight Americans give to individualistic factors can be seen in their assessment of racial issues. In a 2008 Newsweek poll, 67% of Americans agreed with the following statement: blacks who can't get ahead in this country are mostly responsible for their own condition. Only 18% felt that discrimination was the main reason black people can't get ahead these days. Likewise, a recent Pew Research Center survey reported that, quote, fully 2/3 of all Americans believe personal factors, rather than racial discrimination, explain why many African Americans have difficulty getting ahead in life. Just 19% blame discrimination, unquote. Nearly 3/4 of U.S. whites, a majority of Hispanics, and even a slight majority of blacks believe that blacks who have not gotten ahead in life are mainly responsible for their own situation. And I might add that careful analyses of these data reveal that, unlike in previous years, younger African Americans are more likely to support this view than older blacks. Now, I believe that the emphasis on individualistic explanations of economic and social outcomes contributes to a good deal of the opposition to affirmative action programs, especially affirmative action initiatives that are seen as programs of racial preference. Now, in response to cries from conservatives to abolish affirmative action, some liberals have argued that we ought to shift from affirmative action programs based on race to affirmative action programs based on economic class or need. And although it is not readily apparent that a shift to class-based affirmative action would overcome the bias of individualistic explanations of social outcomes, it could be seen as nullifying some of the negative racial perceptions that undermine support for affirmative action. Specifically, it is argued that a shift to class-based affirmative action would recognize that the problems of the disadvantaged, low income, crime-ridden neighborhoods, broken homes, inadequate housing, poor education, cultural and linguistic differences are not always clearly related to previous racial discrimination. Children who grow up in homes plagued by these disadvantages are likely to be denied an equal chance in life because the development of their aspirations and talents is hindered by their environment regardless of race. Proponents of class-based affirmative action argue that people of color would benefit disproportionately from programs designed to address these disadvantages, since they suffer disproportionately from the effects of such environments, but the problems of disadvantaged whites and disadvantaged Latinos would be addressed as well. Now, despite the apparent appeal of this approach, if affirmative action were based solely on economic need, it would reduce opportunities for blacks. More specifically, it would result in the systematic exclusion of many blacks from desirable positions, since they would be judged by conventional measures of aptitude, and regardless of class, their scores on those tests are still likely to show the cumulative effects of race. By this I mean the effects of having one's life choices limited by race, the effects of living in segregated neighborhoods and being exposed to the particular skills and styles of behavior that emerge from patterns of racial exclusion, the effects of attending lower quality de facto segregated schools, and of being nurtured by parents whose own experiences and resources have also been shaped and limited by race. A number of empirical studies have revealed significant differences in the family environment and neighborhood environment of blacks and whites that are understated when standard measures of socioeconomic status are employed. Take, for example, the question of family environment. Even when white parents and black parents report the same average income, white parents have substantially more assets than do black parents. Whites, with the same amount of schooling as blacks, usually attend better high schools and colleges. Furthermore, children's test scores are affected not only by the social and economic status of their parents, but also by the social and economic status of their grandparents. This means that it could take several generations before adjustments and socioeconomic inequality produce their full benefits. Thus, if we were to rely solely on the standard criteria for college admission like SAT scores, even many children from black middle-income families would be denied admission in favor of middle-income whites who are not weighed down by the accumulation of disadvantages that stem from racial restrictions and who therefore tend to score higher on these conventional tests as a result. However, what is true for middle-class blacks is even truer for the black poor, who would not compete well with comparable whites because of the race factor. In an impressive study that analyzes data from a national longitudinal survey with methods designed to measure intergenerational economic mobility, my former student, the sociologist Patrick Sharkey of New York University, found, and I quote, more than 70% of black children who are raised in the poorest quarter of American neighborhoods, that is the bottom 25% in terms of average neighborhood income, will continue to live in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods as adults, more than 70%. He also found that since the 1970s, a majority of black families have resided in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods in consecutive generations, compared to only 7% of white families. Thus, he concludes that the disadvantages of living in black neighborhoods, like the advantages of living in affluent white neighborhoods, are in large measure inherited. Now, we should also consider another path-breaking study that Sharkey co-authored with senior investigator Robert Sampson, also a colleague at Harvard University, and another colleague, Stephen Roddenbush of the University of Chicago, that examined the effects of concentrated poverty on black children's verbal ability. And they studied a representative sample of 750 African American children ages 6 to 12 who were growing up in the city of Chicago in 1995 and followed them anywhere they moved in the United States for up to 7 years. The children were given a reading examination and vocabulary tests at 3 different periods. And their study shows, and I quote, that resulting in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant verbal ability in children, unquote. Now, these research studies suggest that neighborhood effects are not solely what sociologists call structural. Among the effects of living in racially segregated neighborhoods over extended periods is repeated exposure to cultural traits that emanate from or are the products of racial exclusion, traits such as verbal skills that may impede successful maneuvering in the larger society. So for all of these reasons, if we are really concerned about the fate of people of color, I am certainly not persuaded that class-based affirmative action would be an adequate substitute for race-based affirmative action. However, I want to emphasize that strong opposition to quotas and preferential hiring, promotion, and college admission in the United States should not lead us to overlook the fact that there are some affirmative action policies that are supported by wide segments of the population, including the white population, regardless of racial attitudes. As Lawrence Bobo has pointed out, the view that white opposition to affirmative action is monolithic is distorted. Affirmative action policies, as he points out, span a range of policy goals and strategies. Some formulations, for example, race-targeted scholarships or special job outreach and training efforts, can be quite popular. For example, studies reveal that although they oppose, quote, preferential racial policies associated with quotas or job hiring and promotion strategies designed to achieve equal outcomes, most white Americans approve of opportunity-enhancing affirmative action, such as race-targeted programs for job training and education. In the 1990 General Social Survey, 68% of all whites favored spending more money on the schools in black neighborhoods, especially for early education programs. And 70% favored granting special scholarships, special college scholarships to black children who maintain good grades in school. In their 1999 survey of households in the Boston metropolitan area, Barry Bluestone and Mary Huff Stevenson found that whereas only 18% of the white males and 13% of the white females favored or strongly favored job preferences for blacks, 59% of the white males and 70% of the white females favored or strongly favored special job training and educational programs for blacks. And finally, in another national survey, the political scientist Carol Swain found that a majority of respondents, black and white, felt that consideration should be given in college admissions to obstacles or hardships that a student has to overcome. In other words, colleges ought to evaluate a student's potential, at least in part on the basis of his or her successful navigation of different circumstances in, say, high-risk environments. In addition to the standard questionnaire, Swain's survey presented respondents with vignettes that describe college admissions and employment situations without using code words such as preferential treatment. And though responses to the standard questionnaire revealed a clear rejection of the idea that racial preferences should guide admissions decisions, in their responses to the vignettes, these respondents seemed to be asking university admissions officers to take into consideration factors other than the conventional academic criteria. And Swan concludes, and I quote, "The majority of Americans, both white and black alike, are not enthusiastic about racial preference programs, but can agree on some affirmative action-related issues once we move beyond the racially inflammatory code words so often found all too often in existing surveys," unquote. As the sociologist Jerome Carbo reminds us, while it is true that Americans worry about quotas and about unqualified people being hired, promoted, and admitted to colleges and universities, they also recognize, quote, that the playing field is not level and that programs are needed to ensure equal opportunities for minorities and women, unquote. In this connection, an NBC News Wall Street Journal national poll conducted in 2010 revealed that 63% of the respondents agreed with the following statement: affirmative action programs are still needed to counteract the effects of discrimination against minorities and are a good idea as long as there are no rigid quotas, unquote. Accordingly, programs that enable people of color to take advantage of opportunities are less likely to be perceived as challenging the values of individualism and the work ethic. The implications for political framing are obvious. Opportunity-enhancing affirmative action programs tend to be supported because they reinforce the belief that the allocation of jobs and economic rewards should be based on individual effort, training, and talent. Now, implicit in this argument is a view that the remedy does not have to consist of numerical guidelines or quotas. The remedy can be a different set of evaluation criteria, new, more flexible, yet merit-based criteria that are more accurate than the conventional tests engaging the actual potential of Black Americans to succeed. Indeed, it is not readily apparent to what extent the standard measures of aptitude like the SAT or the law school admissions test, the LSAT, or even the tests widely used for promoting police officers, measure real merit, not just privilege. The research reveals that for most applicants, these tests are only tenuously related to future performance. High school grades consistently predict college freshman grades more accurately than the SAT in both selective and non-selective colleges. And little predictive power is gained by combining the SAT with high school grades. And while some cognitive test scores may correlate better with outcomes, even these do not necessarily measure important attributes that also determine performance, such as perseverance, motivation, interpersonal skills, reliability, and leadership qualities. For example, if you compare youngsters from the ghettos of Roxbury or Harlem, New York, or East St. Louis, who display these traits, perseverance, motivation, interpersonal skills, reliability, and leadership qualities, and youngsters from white suburbia who have higher SAT scores but does not possess these traits, the chances are good that the inner city kids will experience a higher level of college achievement and a more enriching college experience. Two studies are relevant here. William G. Bowen and Derek Bach pointed out in their important book, The Shape of the River, that Black students with lower SAT scores who are admitted to selective colleges are not only more involved than white students in social service, community service, and political endeavors, but are also more likely to be leaders in these activities. And likewise, Richard Flax and Scott Thomas report in a study of students at the University of California at Santa Barbara that, quote, African American and Latino students of both sexes were more involved in cultural and community activities than were white males. They were more than twice as likely to report going to plays, concerts, films, and museums. They were 3 times as likely to say that they frequently participated in social service groups, unquote. As the law professors Susan Strom and Lana Grenier have argued, we need to, quote, improve the capacity of institutions to find people who are creative, adaptive, reliable, and committed rather than just good at test taking, unquote. Now, when I call for flexible merit-based criteria, I do not mean that standard aptitude tests such as the SAT should be abandoned. Rather, they should be given less weight in making school admissions decisions. For example, some campuses have developed new admissions criteria, recognizing that the potential for success is demonstrated in numerous forms and can be measured in various ways. And although test scores, courses completed, and grades remain important, these campuses also consider other factors, including an applicant's initiative and leadership ability to overcome personal hardships, self-awareness, civic and cultural awareness, honors and awards, and specialized knowledge. These new criteria reflect the findings of involvement theory. The more students are involved and socialize in their education, the more likely they are to succeed. These new criteria, if used effectively, would be less likely to exclude people who have as much potential to succeed as those promoted or accepted from more privileged backgrounds. And I call this approach, with its emphasis on flexible, merit-based criteria of evaluation, affirmative opportunity, not affirmative action. And the change is more than rhetorical. It signals a shift in emphasis away from quotas and numerical guidelines to guarantee equality of results, which is how affirmative action has come to be understood and widely represented. Instead, the emphasis is on achieving equality of opportunity, a principle that most Americans still support. Now, let me illustrate 2 cases using flexible merit-based criteria. One is the University of Michigan's Law School, whose affirmative action program was supported by the U.S. Supreme Court and was used as an example of how to consider race as one factor in a holistic law school admissions process. The other case is based on my own personal experiences in being the first black to receive tenure in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago in 1972. I was an affirmative action baby, as you will soon learn. The University of Michigan Law School office provides an excellent example of affirmative action based on the use of merit-based flexible criteria of evaluation. Now, as many of you know, the University of Michigan Law School faced an anti-affirmative action lawsuit challenging the denial of admission to a white applicant, Ms. Barbara Grutter. She claimed that she was denied admission in favor of less qualified applicants. However, it is important to note that the University of Michigan's program is not based on racial quotas or numerical guidelines. As Jeffrey Lehman, the previous dean of the University of Michigan Law School, put it before the Supreme Court decided on the Gutter's anti-affirmative action lawsuit, quote, "We are confident that our admissions policy is constitutional It conforms to the requirements of the 14th Amendment as set forth in Justice Powell's opinion in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. Our admissions office does not use racial quotas. The percentage of students of different races in our entering classes vary noticeably from year to year. We use diversity as a factor within the larger context of our policy of admitting only students whom we expect to go on to become outstanding lawyers, unquote. In addition to an index score that represents an applicant's grade point average, an LSAT score, the Michigan Law School Admissions Office relies heavily on a number of other factors associated with the applicant, including among these are letters of recommendation, the quality of the application essay, the quality of the applicant's undergraduate institution, the areas of difficulty in undergraduate course selection, personal experiences or perspectives likely to contribute to our diverse student body, and evidence of leadership ability. As stated in the report and recommendations of the admissions committee, quote, many qualities not captured in grades and test scores figure in the evaluation of an applicant. Precisely which characteristics should be valued is a matter left to the Dean of Admissions and the Admissions Committee. No doubt the kinds of commissions that make for value diversity will change to some degree each year as the composition of the Admissions Committee changes. The very varied perspectives from which different committees will interpret the concept of diversity should further enrich our school, unquote. The point to be emphasized is that the number of minority applicants admitted to the University of Michigan Law School varies each year dependent on the strength of their applications. No numerical guidelines or quotas are set. The use of these flexible criteria that I just described has resulted in an outstanding number of minority law school students over the past several years. My cousin graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, and I spent 2 days on campus with the students several years ago giving a keynote lecture, and I was very impressed. Now, I apply this same principle to the hiring of faculty of color to colleges and universities. And as I was preparing this lecture, I thought about how the hiring and promotion of faculty of color relate to the broader theme of my talk. And when I did this, I also thought about my own experiences when the University of Chicago recruited me years ago. With my tenured appointment to the sociology faculty at the University of Chicago in 1972, I definitely benefited from a type of affirmative action that I now like to call affirmative opportunity. As Malcolm Gladwell, author of the best-selling book Outliers, The Story of Success, as he would put it, I was in the right place at the right time. Now, given the emphasis on affirmative action in the early 1970s, the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago was actively looking for a black sociologist to become a regular member of the faculty. In 1971, I was teaching at the University of Massachusetts, and I was invited to come to the Chicago campus to give a lecture, fully unaware that the sociology faculty were looking me over as a potential member of their department. Now, luckily, I gave, because I was relaxed, I had nothing at stake. I gave one of the best lectures I had ever given at that point in my career. And I impressed the faculty and the graduate students with my deft handling of the questions during the question and answer period. And when I returned to the University of Massachusetts Amherst after the lecture, I was surprised to learn that the sociology faculty at the University of Chicago were actually considering me for a position. I was surprised because unlike an overwhelming majority of faculty at outstanding research-oriented universities in this country, I was not educated at elite universities. Therefore, the odds that I would end up teaching at outstanding universities like the University of Chicago and eventually Harvard were rather slim. In fact, very nearly zero. The senior members of the Department of Sociology at Chicago had read my articles and liked them. However, there was one problem. I had not written a high-quality book when they were initially considering me for a position. To be appointed associate professor with tenure in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago, a scholar had to have at least one book published. The Chicago sociology faculty knew I had been working on a book, Power, Racism, and Privilege, which was eventually published in 1971, or I should say 1972. They were aware that I was working on this book for several years. Actually, the book was published in 1973. They read the book in manuscript form, see. But they were aware that I was working on this book. So in the fall of 1971, they invited me to come as a visiting associate professor for 1 year with a light teaching load, which gave me time to complete the book while I was there, and therefore provided them the opportunity to read a final draft before publication, a final draft of the manuscript to see if I was indeed qualified for tenure. The University of Chicago was on a quarter system at the time, and I had no teaching responsibilities during the first quarter, and I made good use of my free time and completed the book during the winter quarter of 1972. And a tenured faculty in the Department of Sociology at Chicago, at that time the #1 sociology department in the world, read the book in manuscript form, liked it, were impressed, and voted to recommend to the central administration that I be appointed a tenured associate professor. Now, in relating my experiences here, I am providing an excellent example of affirmative action, what I call affirmative opportunity, based on the use of flexible criteria of evaluation. As the late Morris Janowitz, the chair of the Department of Sociology, then told me, when the members of the department first read my articles prior to my lecture, they realized that I had potential. And rather than eliminating me early in the review process, they decided to give me a chance to complete my book to confirm that initial impression. And Janowitz informed me that they wanted to move quickly because, given the growing interest in hiring faculty of color at elite research-oriented institutions, they were fearful that competing universities would rush to hire me. Now, when I talk about flexible criteria of evaluation as applied to faculty of color, I would include evaluative criteria that gauge a candidate's potential to succeed. And in my case, their initial assessment of my potential turned out to be correct. In a recent book, the historian Thomas J. Segru of the University of Pennsylvania probably put it best, quote, in 1972, the University of Chicago had hired a young, relatively unknown black sociologist, William Julius Wilson. Wilson was a bit of a gamble for a high-bound institution like Chicago, with relatively few black faculty members and, despite its location, a small number of black students. Wilson lacked the Ivy League credentials, the European pedigree, and the Chicago degrees of most of the university's faculty, but the gamble paid off. Wilson's 1978 book, The Declining Significance of Race, was a rare scholarly study that won both academic acclaim and a wide non-academic readership, unquote. Thus, when I talk about flexible criteria of evaluation as applied to faculty of color, I would include evaluative criteria that gauge a candidate's potential to succeed. And in my case, their initial assessment of my potential turned out to be correct. I was eventually awarded the National Medal of Science, the highest scientific award in the United States, because Sweden awards a Nobel Prize. Recipients of the National Medal of Science are selected by a 13-member committee from the National Academy of Sciences, who then send their recommendations to the White House. The Nobel laureate economist Kenneth Arrow, who chaired the committee, informed me that the major reason I received the award was because of my innovative approach to the study of urban poverty, most clearly reflected in my book, The Truly Disadvantaged, which developed a paradigm on the interaction of race, class, and location, a paradigm that influenced research across social science disciplines, even research in microeconomics. And is one of the most widely cited books, in the last half century. Again, quoting the historian Thomas Segura, quote, "The Truly Disadvantaged," published in 1987, was sweeping and synthetic, elegantly weaving together problems often considered separately from each other into an overarching theory of urban inequality, unquote. And the scope of this theory is reflected in a wide array of empirical research across disciplines to test my propositions that relate to economic restructuring, neighborhood effects, persistent and concentrated poverty, depopulation, social isolation, and family structure. As I show in the afterword of the new paperback edition of The Truly Disadvantaged, which will be published later this year, most of these studies either support or extend the hypotheses advanced in the book. Now, I say all of this not to brag about or highlight my own accomplishments, but to simply draw from my experiences to illustrate how affirmative opportunity can work in an ideal sense. The concept of affirmative opportunity acknowledges that something more than offering formal legal equality is required to overcome the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. As a society, we have the continuing moral obligation to compensate for the enduring burdens, the social and psychological damage of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry. A policy of affirmative opportunity would anew the nation's commitment to enable all Americans, regardless of income, race, or other attributes, to achieve the highest level that their abilities will permit. To repeat, it is very important to pay very careful attention to how one frames a discussion of affirmative action. And the implications for political framing are obvious. Opportunity-enhancing affirmative action programs, what I call affirmative opportunity, tend to be supported by the American public because they reinforce the belief that the allocation of jobs and economic rewards should be based on individual effort, talent, and training. Affirmative opportunity programs help to achieve what the social philosopher James Fiskin calls equality of life chances. And I'd like to end with this note. According to this principle, if we can predict with a high degree of accuracy where individuals will end up in the competition for preferred positions in society, merely by knowing their family background, race, or gender, then the conditions that affect or determine their motivations and talents are grossly unequal. Supporters of this principle believe that a person should not be able to enter a hospital ward of healthy newborn babies and accurately predict their eventual social and economic position in society solely on the basis of their race and/or economic class origins. Unfortunately, in many urban neighborhoods in the United States and other neighborhoods, rural neighborhoods as well, you can actually make such predictions. Supporters of the principle of equality of life chances feel that it is unfair that some individuals in our society receive every conceivable advantage, while others, from the day they are born, never really have a chance to develop their talents. So in the upcoming debates in the general election, I hope that President Obama will emphasize the importance of what I call affirmative opportunity programs in an effort to promote diversity on college and university campuses. Programs that feature flexible criteria of evaluation to better gauge a student's potential to succeed, and that will help achieve the goal of equality of life chances in this country, to overcome the cumulative effects of chronic racial and economic subordination. Thank you.